Welcome to the Inclusion Think Tank podcast brought to you by New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education, NJCIE. As the name suggests, this podcast will discuss inclusive education and, most importantly, why it works. On today's episode, we welcome our guest, LeDerick Horne. LeDerick is a poet, advocate, and speaker. During our conversation today, we discuss how teachers can support those students with hidden disabilities as it relates to inclusive education. I would like to welcome everyone back to another episode of the Inclusion Think Tank podcast presented by New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education. I'm your host, Arthur Aston, and I'm very happy to welcome my guest today, poet, advocate, and speaker, LeDerick Horne, to the podcast. Welcome, and we are very happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Art.
Yeah. So, in researching for this episode, for this conversation with you, I read your bio on your website, and it said that you are a bridge builder between learners and leaders. And I really love that because I think, um, it's something that does have to be bridged, because the learners and the leaders and the teachers and everybody else in that education world, everybody must, they must work together. They must find a way to connect to each other. So I love that analogy that you use of being a bridge builder. And with that in mind, can you tell us what inclusive education means to you and how would you define inclusive education?
Well, I would define inclusive education as a uh, collaborative approach to education that utilizes the resources of everyone in the school community in order to uh, foster the success of all students. And what it means to me is that it allows a pathway by which we can rethink and reimagine education, um, and particularly for those of us who are folks with disabilities, those of us who are neurodiverse. Um, I would really say just for any sort of marginalized people passing through the education system, I think that it allows for a different approach to education that increases the probability that we'll all be successful.
Yes, I think that is the biggest goal there, that we were all successful and we reach our full potential, our fullest potential, because we all have something to contribute to the world, to society, to our communities. And again, it's that bridge building, that connecting the two sides of the learners and the educators and everybody involved in the school system, that this can be achieved by working collaboratively. And so that's I love that answer, and I love the last statement of it, that we can all be successful, because that is, as someone who lives with a disability, I know I have faced a lot of stereotypes that people have had about those who have disabilities, and my disability is visible, so it's automatically assumed that I can't do certain things. So I really have had that struggle and had those challenges placed in front of me by other people most of my life, and thankfully I have worked my way through it, and I think we can all really uh, benefit from an inclusive education setting, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and I'm a person with a learning disability, so my challenges aren't necessarily as visible. The other thing about that line, I think, which is powerful, is particularly when it comes to inclusive education, is I think there's an embedded within there that that students are a part of the process, right? That inclusive education is something, and education in general is something that should not just be handed down from the adults in the room, but that the student voice, the student voice for an individual student in their education is important, and I think that is in line with um, the ideals of self-determination and self-advocacy. And then I also think as far as the shaping of policies and practices, that students should have a say in that as well. So yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out.
Yeah, it is. It's so important that we, as the student, that the student has a voice as well, whether it's through themselves or through their parents or, another advocate in that way. But it's important that all voices at the table be heard and listened to and contribute to the conversation of how the inclusive education setting can work for everybody because it improves the classroom for everybody involved. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So, as you mentioned, you do have a learning disability. You were diagnosed in the third grade. Um, what is it that you remember about your learning experience after your diagnosis? Were you in an inclusive classroom that included your peers that were also with and without disabilities, or how how was your school experience after your diagnosis of with the learning disability?
Well, we're gonna really drill down to it, right? When I was first diagnosed, when I was 9 years old, I was in the third grade. The first label I was given was that I was neurologically impaired. And I'm not sure at the time whether that was a shorthand for a specific learning disability or what have you. But what I do know from talking to colleagues who were working in education at the time, particularly here in New Jersey, was that that was a fairly common label given, particularly to Black boys. Um, who were being recognized as needing support for special education. So, was I in an inclusive educational setting? Absolutely not. I was, I'm a part of the first generation of people to pass through what we now refer to as special education. And a big part of that was, I think, around just trying to figure out where to place us in the school. So I was initially in a resource room, which was a teacher's storage closet, and then placed into a self-contained special education classroom that was at the end of the hall in my elementary school. And that's basically where I stayed all day long. We would go down the hall as a class to art class. Um, we would go down the hall for gym together, and then, the go to the cafeteria for lunch. But for the most part, I spent about 3.5 years in this one room with the same teacher and the same students. So I would not think of it as an inclusive setting. I would think of it as being a very segregated setting. Not, of course, not the worst form of segregation. You know, we have plenty of schools here in the state of New Jersey and then all over the country, and districts that build entirely separate schools for students with learning disabilities or other disabilities. So it wasn't to that extreme, but I remember very early on feeling like I was less than other students, right? And it really began like I recall the first day, right, where like I been in, regular ed classes, and then like here's the day where you're going to start going to special ed. And that very first morning I go to my bus stop and a short bus pulls up. And so it was sort of determined that even the transportation that I was going to utilize in order to get back and forth to school was going to be segregated. That's a real slap in the face. You know, my grandfather was Simeon Horne. He passed away in 2013, but he was the head of the New Brunswick chapter of the NAACP during the heart of the civil rights movement. And he's a part of the generation who fought and put their lives on the line to integrate our schools, to integrate public transportation. And here I am, his grandson, and because of a cognitive difference, I have to ride on a segregated bus and go to a very segregated setting to be educated. Um, and so, yeah, so I was not in an inclusive setting. I remember that separation, that segregation, really working away on how I felt about myself, um, left me with a lot of emotional scars that even now as an adult, I am still working very hard to rectify and correct. Um, and so I for the families, for the educators listening to this, I would caution everyone to really think about the way in which we engineer education, and particularly around the places where where we put our students within our schools, because it does have a lasting effect, and of the adults, the young adults and the full grown adults that I have had the pleasure of working with and getting to know over the years, those of us with disabilities um, who still struggle, or maybe who have reached a degree of success and are still sort of working through different issues. Most of us are dealing with issues related to mental health, right? It tends not to be like at a certain point you can figure out all the accommodations. I still have issues with spelling. I still have issues with reading, but I figured a lot of that out, right? Where I can be a functional, contributing, member of our society. Um, but that classroom, that separate space, still sits within me. And the challenge also comes because I had a great special ed teacher. I mean, this woman was remarkable. Academically, I did a lot better. Um, but separate is rarely equal. And and we all tend to compare ourselves to our peers. And I was very clear that I was sort of ranked towards the bottom of our school's hierarchy. And so it left a lasting effect on me. So much so that as I was facing graduation from high school, I was in my junior year. I actually had what I diagnosed as an emotional breakdown because I could not conceptualize what was going to happen to me as an adult. I had never seen any examples of people who were in special ed who were as successful as I wanted to be. I didn't um, I didn't see any examples of anyone had the same challenges around learning, who was able to go to college and then have an excellent career. And so and I was just honestly exhausted after years of trying to pass for normal. Um, so it just got to the point where I couldn't hack it anymore. But I was fortunate that in that dark space, I used it as an opportunity to just redefine who I wanted to be, redefine who I thought I was, and I just got determined that I was going to have an excellent future. And so I came out of that with a drive to go to college, and I was able to achieve that. I was a part of a great support system for folks with disabilities, and it was really only when I got to college that I got to be a part of what I think of as an inclusive educational setting. Special ed was done. I had to go to class with everybody else. I got my accommodations. I took my test outside of the class. And it was in that setting where I was really able to blossom. So a big part of the work that I do now is just around helping people to reimagine what our schools can look like. That um, I think there's a sort of organizational momentum that gets built up, and it becomes very easy just to keep doing things the way that we've always been doing them. But my own personal experience and then my professional experience tells me that the way most of our schools function does not serve all students. So yeah, so um, I'm a big supporter of inclusion, and primarily because I didn't get it while I was going through school.
Yeah, it's so funny, like thinking back now, and listening to what you were saying about where the special ed classrooms were in the building and what message that sends to the student. Like, and even like you said, when you went to the bus stop and you saw the shorter bus show up, it's like that's something I never thought about it that way. And it's just like automatically you realize that you are segregated and you're different than everybody else. And it's like,
Yeah, man.
it's like, wow,
It was in my IEP, or like,
wow,
short bus, ride the short bus. Like I don't know how that was supposed to help me learn algebra, right?
right.
But 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 and I think like so much of this comes out of like, I think a clear understanding of the history of our educational system,
Hmm.
um, the fact that we had so many people with disabilities who were legally prevented from going to school with everybody else. And so, there's this intense need to sort of maintain a wall between the regular kids and us, right? And so that begins with transportation and continues through where we get placed within the school building itself.
Yeah, and I also loved what you mentioned about your grandfather and what he fought for, and then here you are, you know, facing the same things that he was fighting against, and trying to fix in society, and so that's really very powerful message that you said, and really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and before you go to the next question, I think it is important too that we also just remember that there is a racial component to all of this as well, right?
Hmm.
Like, we get disproportionality it tends to be a really real problem. Here in New Jersey, we have real issues around it that have been documented for many, many years. Unfortunately, far too many Black and brown boys are the ones who tend to get placed in these segregated settings. When there are issues around challenges with learning, we tend to be the ones who get placed with the diagnosis that don't necessarily lead to supports with learning, but instead deal with being separated from everybody else. So yeah, I hope that my work now is a continuation of my grandfather's fight.
Yeah. So the next question I have, I admit it was not on the original set of questions I sent you, but I have to bring it up.
Yeah.
In researching, and as I mentioned in your intro, you are a poet. I listened to your albums over the last week or so, and I really love the Alex Place soundtrack. So can you talk about your poetry and um, your writing, and how did you use that as a way to help you, uh, cope with life and your disability, and just getting through school, and what that process is for you, and how do you come up with such great poetry tracks?
Yeah, well, thank you for that.
Yes.
Um, so when art has always been an important part of my life. Um, and I think I was showing signs of being a writer and a wordsmith and a poet when I was very, very young. But sort of the tyranny of spelling prevented me from expressing any of that ability. I didn't learn to really write until I got to college, and once I learned how to write a grammatically correct sentence and then essays. Um, and then once I got the freedom to just write and not worry about spelling until the final draft, um, then that gave me the freedom to begin to write poetry. But I was always um, obsessively trying to capture language expressed well. And so when I was real young, it was a tape recorder that I would carry around with me and record dialogue from TV or song lyrics that I really enjoyed. So it's always been there. And then, it's a lot of Black boys in special ed. And, I went through school in the 80s and the 90s, and um, I was surrounded by a lot of guys that were remarkable MCs. And so, the ability to rap and express themselves and express very, very complicated ideas in very complex and entertaining ways. That was something that was always around me. And my father was a cross country coach, and so he could, motivate people and tell a story. And same for my grandfather. So I was surrounded by words. And Early on in life, I really expressed myself through visual art. So it's drawing. And I have a BA in mathematics, and I minored in fine art with an emphasis in painting. But I'm more of a draftsman than anything. But once I got to college and once I learned how to write prose, then I allowed myself to be a poet, and started going to open mics and performing. And the earliest poetry that I remember hearing were my mother's like last poet albums. And the last poets were a revolutionary poetry group from the 60s. And then as I got older, just poetry for me always became about giving voice to political struggle. So once I graduated from college and began doing work around advocating for people with disabilities, it almost felt natural that I would apply my writing skills to this struggle. Yeah, that's I tend to start every single one of my workshops or my keynotes with poetry, work it in throughout, end with a poem. Sometimes I have teachers writing raps, doing things like that. I find it to be a very effective tool to teach and to teach with, and then also an effective tool in being able to convey the emotion of where I think we need to be in order to get this work done.
Yeah, I was really excited to see that you had the poetry albums out. I write a little bit myself, and I primarily for me it was to express the emotion of things that I was dealing with at the time, whether it be happy things, sad things, things that irritated me and made me angry. So just writing and getting it out, and so I really was interested in hearing how you came to be a poet, and I think it's great how you said like it was in you because of your father and your grandfather and your mom, like showing hearing poetry from them and storytellings and all of that from them. That's really really great. So you have written a book called "Empowering Students with Hidden Disabilities: A Path to Pride and Success." And within that book, you provide insight on how students with disabilities, like learning disabilities and other hidden disabilities, can be supported. Can you share with us what an inclusive classroom that supports students with hidden disabilities would look like to you?
I think there are a number of elements. One of the things that I think is really specific for the challenges faced by students with hidden disabilities is that many of us can choose to be closeted as people with disabilities, right? So even now as an adult, if I wanted to, I could go through my whole life and kind of act like reading and spelling and math is not a big issue for me, right? And maybe if I'm lucky, I can find myself in a job or a career that plays more to my strengths and less to my challenges, and I can just kind of coast on by. I know that was a big part of like how I just sort of spent my energy and where my thoughts went when I was a young person. Just like I'm gonna try to act like everybody else, right? Now, if I had a wheelchair,
Mm-hmm.
that might be a little bit harder, right?
Mm-hmm.
People would look at me and be like, "Nah, there's something else going on," right? But I've seen this, like I have a colleague with a visual impairment who just started losing his sight in middle school, and he talked about, getting to the point where it was like dangerous for him to be moving around without utilizing a cane. Like it took him actually falling down a flight of stairs in his school and thankfully not hurting himself, but sitting there on his back and being like, all right, I gotta really embrace this. And so I think the piece around embracing your disability is one that we really lean into in the book, both me and my co-author, Dr. Margot Izzo. Um, that disability can be a positive identifier, that there's a lot of strength that actually comes from incorporating disability and being part of your identity, and that it doesn't need to be something that is stigmatized, but can instead be thought of as being a part of the continuum of human diversity. So, a classroom where every student is very clear about what their strengths and their challenges are. I can see a classroom where, and particularly as our students get older, where they're able to articulate to their teacher, no, this is how I need this information presented to me. And then I think it's also for me, it's also a place where, regardless of how a student presents, that all of our educators are looking for the ways in which they can be of most support, right, for all of our students, and particularly those with hidden disabilities.
Yeah, that as you said, it's like I mentioned, I use crutches and a wheelchair at times, so it is very difficult for me to, I can't hide uh,
Right.
my disability at all. People might not know what it is right away when they see me or when I approach, but they know, like you said, something else is going on here. um,
Right.
so, so
And
but,
and
uh-huh.
yeah, and I wonder, like, and it's probably, if this is right, I'm sure it's probably annoying, but I'm sure you also have probably people offering help all the time, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah, right.
yeah,
Like, and probably unwanted most of the time, right?
yes.
So,
I'm glad.
and
I
and that
I
and
am glad
go
that they
ahead.
ask. I'm glad that they ask if I need help, though, because there are the people that just go right for it and they grab the bags from you, or they, oh, here, let me help you. It's like, no, 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 please, please don't,
Right.
because
I got
that
it.
can
I'm
harm.
good.
Yeah, yeah, I've been doing this a long time, like this, and that can actually cause more harm than good, because if you grab something from me and I'm on my crutches, I can fall. I can, it throws off my balance and I can fall. So it's always appreciated that people ask before they help. And
Right.
I can
It's,
gladly tell them, thank you, I got it, and and then we move on from there. But just don't
yeah.
walk up and grab stuff from me and all of that. That's the word.
And the challenge for, folks with hidden disabilities is no one's going to ask us for help,
Hmm.
right? And and particularly as you transition into the adult world, and whether it be trying to find success within a institution of higher education or independent living or in the workforce, no one's going to ask for help. Like I have to, right? And it's part of the work that I do, is encouraging our students to be comfortable raising their hand and saying, "Hey, I need assistance here." And that goes from just sort of navigating the world, right into accessing the offices of accessibility and disability supports on a college campus, or going to HR on your job and saying, "Hey, here are some accommodations that I need," or being comfortable having a conversation with the people that you meet, friends, family, associates, about the sort of supports that you might need, just to make a social interaction happen in an optimal way, right?
Yeah.
Like I get really distracted. We're talking here, but I'm like watching squirrels, right?
Hmm.
Out of my window here, right? Like distraction is a big issue for me. And so, when I go out to dinner, uh, we're recording this during the pandemic, but like when we used to go out to dinner,
Hmm.
I would always have to make sure that like I'm not facing the big screen TV, or or the window or what have you. Like if I'm trying to have a conversation with my wife, I'm trying to have a conversation with my wife, and so I'll do all that I can to kind of block out those distractions.
Yeah, it goes back to what you were saying before of embracing your disability and knowing what being comfortable, like you said, being comfortable with saying, like, hey, I didn't understand that, I need some
Right.
assistance.
Right.
Can you repeat that, or bring that back around for me one more time, and let me know. And then also um, creating the setting for yourself, as you just mentioned, of using the going out to dinner as an example, blocking out those barriers for yourself that would cause a distraction, if that is your if that's something that is difficult for you to focus when other things are going on. So, yeah, thank you for uh, this great conversation. Again, it was really great to meet you virtually, and thank you for your time today, and for the information you shared, and uh, sharing your story. I really appreciate that part of this conversation. I think it's important that we do hear real stories of um, people with disabilities, like yourself, who have gone through the education system, and now you're doing something to make it better, to improve it for other students coming up now. And so I really appreciate this conversation, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Inclusion Think Tank podcast. This podcast is brought to you by New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube or Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on social media at NJCIE. Until next time.